back in the times when the natives were still a-raiding around the Appalachian Mountains. There was an old bear that had the people more scared than the Indians ever did. Oh, he was a terror. As big as a horse, people said, and ferocious too. It seemed like a bullet didn't even tickle him. And if he was hit, he'd just shake himself and go right on about his business. He raided pig pens, carried off sheep, and wasn't even afraid to hang around the cabin at night and take a grab at anybody that came out. It got so bad that folks were afraid to be out after dark. Well, the critter went over to Briarcliff Ridge one night and got into the pig pen of a fella named Joe Dowdy. Now Joe and his wife Millie, they didn't hear a sound. It was raining and they were busy moving furniture here and there, trying to keep the rain from getting it all wet. Their old roof leaked like a faucet. No sooner than they would get their bed moved from one place it was dripping, than lo and behold, it would start dripping on it again in the new place. I tell you, Millie, we got to get us a new tin roof. We're gonna lose all the furniture we have. Heck, with all the noise they made, dragging the bed and the chest and the table around, and with the rain beating down on the tin roof, they never heard their hog outside squealing away. That's right, the bear killed the pig and dragged him behind the barn, where he made a full meal out of him, hair, hide, hoof, and all. Then, with his belly full, the bear laid down under the eaves of the barn, where he was protected from the rain, and took himself a nap. It was too bad about Joe's hog, because, well, it was his last one. It was all he and Millie had to provide meat for the entire winter. But, you see, Joe was the kind of man that seemed born for bad luck. If he planted a corn patch, there would be rain all around the country, but never a drop in his field. His neighbor's corn would grow green and tall, while Joe's would burn up for the lack of water. And his livestock were always dying off with one thing or another. It just seemed he couldn't get ahead. Now Millie didn't have any better luck than her husband. Foxes caught her chickens, and her turkeys got lost in the woods. So it went until the night the bear paid them a visit. And by that time, Joe and Millie had nothing in this world but their leaky cabin, the hog, and one old horse. And now, though they didn't know it yet, their hog was inside of that bear. Along about 4 o'clock in the morning, when the rain let up a little, Joe and Millie sat down in front of the fireplace and began to talk about their situation. If I could only get that reward that they're offering for that old bear, oh, it would put us on easy street, Joe said. It's a lot of money. I might just try it. Oh, why don't you just talk some sense? Millie said impatiently. Everybody in the mountains has already tried it. Folks has gone in bands to get him. He clawed Jake Sandler, and he raked open Solly Sneed. He just about chewed off the arm of Sam Tollin. He's killed so many dogs that there's hardly any left to chase rabbits, I tell you. Everybody's scared of that critter, and you think you can just go out and get him all by your lonesome? And what are you going to hunt him with? You sold your gun 3 months ago, and nobody's going to lend you his, not with that bear likely to show up anywhere. Are you aiming to go out and get him just with your bare hands? Oh, I tell you, you'd be better off going and looking for a job. I heard yesterday that the miller down the creek a piece is looking for a man to help with the grinding. Why don't you get your tail down there and ask for a job? Well, I ain't got no better chance of getting that job as I do of killing that bear. There's a score of younger men that want that job. Well, don't be so chicken-hearted, exclaimed Millie. If you're the first one there in the morning, you'll get it. Well, Joe said doubtfully, I reckon it wouldn't hurt to try. Get out right now and saddle up your horse and get along. What? It's dark now, said Joe. I can't even see to saddle the horse. Oh, quit your complaining. You'll manage with the horse. Just do it by feel. Day'll be breaking an hour from now, and the miller will be ready to pick his man and get on with his grinding, and you'll be there. If you get there an hour early, you'll be set. Today's video is sponsored by the Appalachian Storyteller candles. Handcrafted the old-fashioned way, one at a time, in the mountains of East Tennessee. Click the link below to order your custom candle today. Well, Joe got up, clamped some spurs on his boots, for his poor old horse needed all the urging he could get, and then he put on his coat. But just then he had a thought, so he turned to his wife. Well, Millie, it's dark as Egypt outside. Suppose that old bear might be hanging around out there. Oh, shucks, that bear is miles away. He got a calf last night at Alf Henry's place. That's a good 15 miles from here. Well, that is a far piece. I reckon it's safe enough to get out. So with that, Joe said goodbye and he walked out to the barn. It had stopped raining, but the clouds were still hanging low. Not a star could be seen, and Joe couldn't make out a single thing in the dark. He found the barn easy enough because he knew every stone on the path. He felt his way to the place where he kept his saddle and his bridle, and then he made his way to the stall where his horse was kept. But once he was inside the stall, he couldn't find the horse. He wasn't in there, and that was strange since animals don't like being outside on a rainy night. The fact is that the horse had smelled that bear and had clean run away in the woods. Now doggone it, where's that horse? He went outside and he stumbled here and there, feeling along the fences and around the well, and then he looked back towards the barn and he felt along the walls. At the back, he stumbled over the bear who was laying under the eaves sound asleep. Joe put out his hand and he felt the hair on the bear's neck. "Oh, there you are, you crazy critter." He grabbed the bear by the ear. "Haven't you got enough sense to stay out of the rain?" Well, the bear was so full with that entire hog in his stomach that he didn't even wake up, and he just sat there snoring away. So Joe reached down and opened his mouth and put the bit in, and then buckled the bridle over his head, and threw the saddle across the bear's back, and then gave him a stiff kick in the ribs. "Now get up, you no-count critter. Let me fasten this belly band." The bear aroused himself groggily, and then hoisted himself up on his feet, as Joe quickly fastened the belly band. Then he leaped into the saddle and gave the critter a jab with his spurs. Oh, that woke the bear up for sure, as he felt the thing tied around his middle and the load on his back. He gave himself a terrific shake. It almost threw poor Joe out of the saddle. "What's the matter with you?" he cried, as he beat the bear's head with the handle of his whip. The bear had never had anything like this in his life happen to him. He reached around to claw Joe off his back, but his arms wouldn't reach. He couldn't get his head back far enough to bite him, and all that time, Joe was beating him about the ears with the handle of the whip and sticking him with his spurs. "Come on now, let's get," Joe yelled. The night was so black that Joe never had any idea what he was contending with, and that old bear was scared out of his wits. He took off down the road just as fast as he could gallop. Every now and then, he'd hump himself and jump in the air, trying to throw off whatever was on him. And never in his life had Joe had such a ride. Who would have thought the old horse still had it in him, he wondered. It was a good 7 miles to the mill, and that bear ran every step of the way. By the time he got there, he was near death. He was so tuckered out that when Joe pulled up on the reins to stop him, he just stood swaying with his tongue hanging out, and all of the fight in him was gone. Still in the dark, Joe threw the halter rope around the hitching post and tied it. Then he sat down on the steps of the mill to wait for the miller to appear. It wasn't long before sunrise began to lighten the sky as the day came in. Old man Johnson entered his mill through his back door and unlocked the front one, ready to do some business. Just then, he saw Joe leaning against the wall. "Well, morning there, Joe Howdy. Have you come from some meal? What are you doing here so early?" "Well, I rode here," said Joe, pointing his thumb over his shoulder. "That's my horse out there on the hitching post." The miller looked around, and his eyes popped almost out of his head as he fell backwards. There stood the bear, saddled and bridled and tied to the hitching post. "You rode that?" squalled the miller. "Yep, I sure did," said Joe without turning around. The miller just gulped and stuttered. He stared at Joe as though he had never seen him before. He'd never thought that Joe Dowdy was such of a man. But there was that bear, the very bear that had been terrorizing the whole settlement. And here was Joe, acting as though bear taming was nothing at all. "I came to see you about that job." Joe stuttered a little. "I'd love to have it if you ain't got a man no better." "But better?" stammered the miller. "Where would I find a man better than you? You can have the job, and welcome." By the time folks had begun to arrive with their meal, they saw that bear tied to the hitching post, and they were struck dumb with astonishment. At first, they all just stood there gawking, and then they began carrying on, asking all sorts of questions. "Well, who rode that?" They stared at the bear, and then at the miller. "Well, I tell you, Joe rode him up here just before daybreak." Well, Joe turned around to see what all the commotion was about, And when he saw that bear, his eyes flew open. His heart almost stopped. He was so shocked that the breath went out of him and he couldn't say a word. "Well, Joe, you're the man who's going to get that reward," the miller said, "and you sure have earned it. But tell me though, how'd you manage it?" But in that moment, Joe was so scared, all he could say is, "I'd rather not talk about it." Well, the fame of old Joe Dowdy went all over the mountains. Such a stout-hearted fella had never been seen since this land had been settled. And the money for capturing that bear came in mighty handy for Joe and Millie. Joe and Millie bought themselves some new chickens, several hogs, a new horse, and, best of all, they got that new tin roof.